Okay, so I welcome you all to the second keynote lecture of the day by Etienne Balibar, and the chair of the session would be Professor Divya Dwivedi.
Okay, so good afternoon, and apologies for cutting short the break due to the series of delays, but fortunately these delays are only about 10 minutes. And so I request everyone to gather back to their seats. And we now begin the third keynote of this conference on critical philosophy of caste and race on the architectures of inequality. And I am extremely honored and very, very delighted that we are going to have with us Professor Etienne Balibar to speak on a subject on which he has contributed some of the most important anti-racist concepts in our time, and who has traced all the capillaries of racisms in various parts of the world. And now, as we start this initiative to discuss caste and race internationally, globally, together, we are really fortunate that we are going to listen to the latest reflections of Professor Balibar. I'm going to read a brief note on his career, even though we all know and love him for a long time. Etienne Balibar has taught moral and political philosophy in the University Paris 10, Nanterre, and also at the University of California, Irvine. He holds a visiting anniversary chair in modern European philosophy at the Kingston University. Until recently, he was also visiting professor regularly at the Columbia University. As we know, his research interests include political philosophy from Aristotle to Hannah Arendt, passing through the philosophers Spinoza, Hegel, and of course Marx, as well as recent and contemporary French philosophy, especially, how can we forget, Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, but also Maurice Blanchot. He has addressed the question of critique with special reference to religion, to political economy, to racism, nation, and nationalism. And he is published widely in areas of epistemology, Marxist philosophy, moral and political philosophy more widely. His works, of course, include Reading Capital, which was co-authored with Louis Althusser, Pierre Macheret, Jacques Rancière, Roger Establé in 1965. And then these very important series of texts, The Philosophy of Marx, Spinoza and Politics, Politics and the Other Scene, We the People of Europe. I must pause on this particular title because it is still very rare to find the top echelons of philosophy in Europe probing, interrogating, and critiquing the idea of Europe and European people in the way that Etienne Balibar did that early on. Also very important books like Equiliberty, Violence and Civility, which is on the limits of political friendship, political philosophy, Citizen Subject, The Foundations of Philosophical Anthropology, and more recently, Secularism and Cosmopolitanism. And of course, how can we not mention, I've reserved the last place for his co-authored book, Race, Nation and Class, first published in French in 1988 and then soon after in English with Emmanuel Wallerstein, which made the famous vital conception of a neo-racism, or a racism without races, at a time when Islamophobia and other forms of racism were on the rise. So I'm delighted to invite Etienne Balibar to give his keynote address, and we look forward to engaging discussion after that, although we are short of time. So Etienne, c'est à toi. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you so much. Okay, this is very frustrating in a sense, because I don't see you really, but I hope that you see me. Do you see me and hear me? Yes or no?
Yes, yes, we hear you. Can you see the room? It should be visible now.
I see the room from very far away. Yes.
Okay, okay. I can assure you the room is full and very warm and eager to listen, and we're ready.
I see that. I see that. I see that, Divya. Yes. Okay, shall I begin?
Yes.
Very well. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to be delivering this keynote lecture to the International Conference on Architectures of Inequality, held at the Indian Institute of Technology on the invitation of my friend Dr. Divya Dwivedi and all the other organizers, to whom I want to express my deep gratitude. Although I'm not able to be with you in person, and this is, I repeat, a little frustrating, thus renewing my memories from the visits I paid to the city, to your city and your country in the past, a long time ago now. And thus, of course, adding new conversations, which I'm sure would have been very rewarding. Still, I'm happy that technology gives me the possibility to take part from afar and hopefully exchange with you some ideas on a subject of primary importance for us all. I thank you very much for this opportunity. You will believe it or not, but I did not really choose the subject of my lecture today. It was proposed, I wouldn't say imposed, but proposed by Dr. Dwivedi after I had shared with her some old material from my teaching, to which I would refer in a moment. But I was very glad to, because I thought that it would give me a unique possibility to add some precisions, hypotheses, and diagnoses to a problematic of race and racism that I have pursued over the years. In a sense, this research originated in an encounter that took place in this very place, Delhi. It was there that more than 40 years ago, in 1981, I met with Immanuel Wallerstein on the occasion of a conference on class and status groups in the world economy that he organized jointly with the Indian Science Research Council and renowned Indian scholars, including Professors Barunde, Romila Tapar, Omio Bakshi, Bipan Chandra, and others. The discovery of India and the meetings with all these colleagues and friends, or soon becoming friends, formed a turning point in my life. Shortly after that, Immanuel and I realized that we had a parallel interest in the questions of race and ethnicity, and we decided to start the seminar that led to the publication of the book that you have just mentioned, Race, Nation, Class, Ambiguous Identities, in 1988. My reflections today are to an important extent revisions of hypotheses that I had formulated in that book. Before I enter the presentation of the main points that I want to discuss under this heading, I need some preliminaries and general remarks. First, I want to draw our attention to the fact that asking a question about the future of racism or racisms in the plural involves a kind of tautology that is also indicative of a conceptual nexus, perhaps a riddle. It is like asking a question about the future of the past in general and more specifically. This is not only because, officially at least, racism as ideology and institution is supposed to belong to the past of humankind, the times, not so old in fact, of its hierarchies and exclusions, or to exist today only in the modality of remnants of that past, so that the question becomes, for how long will the past survive? To what extent will it become transferred into the future or shape that future? A question especially intriguing and irritating if we assume that we live in an age of cultural and technological revolutions which would radically change the face of our world. Would racism be one of the things that we keep from the ancient regime? But more speculatively, there is a quasi-ontological element at stake in that question, since race itself is a name for the past, a way privileged in many respects to elaborate the past, to construct it, to invent it for oneself and others, to create an imaginary of the past that is or becomes the past itself, inasmuch as it remains active, binding for subjects and societies, imperative for their future. Excuse me, I'm trying something. Is that okay if I put that light on?
Yes, in fact, we see you much better now.
Oh, okay, good. And I see better my my paper.
Okay.
Thank you so much. In 2004, as I was teaching at the University of California, Irvine, in the company of my master Jacques Derrida, a conference about racism was organized there, in which we both participated. That was shortly before he passed away, with the title Traces, right, with capital R in the middle, T capital R-A-C-E-S, a portmanteau writing combining race and trace, a typical Derridian concept. The suggestion was that the essence of race is to be a trace, to permanently rewrite or overwrite the past into the present and the future. A specific past, indeed, and as critics are eager to demonstrate, an imaginary past, a reified past. But it could be argued that this is par excellence the past as past, since it names where we come from, where we are supposed to come from. A descent. I will, of course, have to return to that extremely important word. Another name for that could be precisely genealogy. As a consequence, our problem today is anything but a particular question about which cultural forms, which violences, which struggles await us in the future. It is rather a singular and privileged way of asking the question of the future itself in the fields of civilization, historicity, politics, as continuity and discontinuity. But to what extent should we accept the idea that racism and racisms are remnants of the past? An official idea whose reverse side seems to be the permanent necessity of eliminating its metamorphoses the so-called new racisms. Rather than elaborating once again on the issue of the contradiction between the official principles and the practical realities, whence arises the endless task of adjusting the latter to the former, which sets the program for the anti-racist organizations and movements, I will jump into the concerns, the most urgent concerns of our present, concerns which I understand are especially strong in India, but no less, believe me, in my country, France, or in Trump's America. And I will ask the question, should we not expect a return in many or most countries of the world of institutional racism? A racism not just practiced or tolerated or even tacitly encouraged, but legalized, implemented by state administrations, and justified by official discourses of hate and discrimination, which contradict the spirit and the letter of the documents that defined the international order after World War II, after decolonization and the abolition of racial segregation as an institutional framework. My reason to ask the question lies in the simple observation of the new virulence of nationalism in today's globalized world, which I combine with the analysis of modern racism as, I quote, an internal supplement of nationalism that I had proposed in precisely Race, Nation and Class almost 40 years ago. This is a formula that has been, of course, disputed, and I understand why. It should not be understood, from my point of view, as a way of exclusively deriving racism from nationalism, as if there are no other determinations. But yes, it does assert that there is a specific articulation of nationalism and racism, which is manifest in the case of every institutional racism in modern times, asserted and implemented by the nation state, hence the national state never to be separated, of course, from an imperial, a colonial, or a post-colonial state, making thus the racial other the internal enemy of the national community. It should also not be understood as if racism simply expresses the logic of nationalism, adding nothing significant to its implications. In my use, the category of the supplement that I borrow from Derrida, as you imagine, means just the opposite. Not every nationalism is racist, or better, nationalism is not just the same as racism in any circumstance. Racism does introduce an additional element of ideology and political activism to what we might call the routine of normal nationalism. Normal in that sense that without it, in fact, there can exist no nation. But this additional element first isolates and exacerbates a constituent part of the national formation. I would say the genealogical element or the totalitarian element, at the expense of others, the civic element, the social element. And second, it becomes the imaginary condition for the survival of the nation in situations, in historic situation of potential disaggregation due to wars, economic crises, civil wars, and other catastrophes. This is indeed an addition of identity or sameness that history shows, demonstrates dramatically, exacerbates the crises and catastrophes rather than healing them. But it is no less insistent for that. Do we not observe such a mechanism at work in the current global situation, where the crises and catastrophes are not lacking? In one country after the other, in the north and the south, the east and the west, nationalism becomes actively xenophobic, intolerant of every form of difference, including sexual difference. It gains influence among the people of every social classes. It develops a discourse reminiscent of 20th century fascism, and it rises to power. In each country, of course, the style is specific due to different political traditions, different locations in the geopolitical framework. But the analogies are obvious, and the general tendency now looks like a rising tide. My guess is that this movement is not going to stop, even if there are democratic resistances and counterattacks, which, of course, I hope. We will face a genuine counter-revolution with respect to the recognition of universalistic principles, both nationally and internationally, leading to a reintroduction of something that seemed precisely to belong to a past and had been repeatedly condemned. A reintroduction at different levels and in different forms of racist institutions, establishing legal discriminations, justifying processes of social and territorial elimination, or, to borrow Saskia Sassen's excellent category, expulsions, if not extermination of the aliens. That had been declared, something that had been declared abolished by the dominant discourse. Whether the old names such as apartheid, race itself, or the old criteria, the color, the cultural values, the purity of descent, etc., will remain unchanged is an open question. But what seems also certain is that the new institutionalization of race that I anticipate, perhaps I should say, whose first steps we already observe, will make intensive use of the traces, inscribing itself in a genealogy that recapitulates or reactivates different layers from a long and conflictual racial past, theological, political, colonial, pre-colonial, and post-colonial, etc. That such developments cannot be explained without an analysis of the determinations of the current crisis of the nation form itself goes without saying, but I must leave this open for the moment. Since I was so long on these first preliminaries, but how to avoid them, I should be try and be quicker now. But let me give a brief indication for which I ask the permission to refer to my own work. Internal supplement is or was a good notion, or so I hope, because it hints at paradoxes rather than evidences. But it does not say enough about the schemas of thought that can bind together organically, so to speak, the discourses of nationalism and racism, or provide a translation of nation into race and conversely. An additional step is required to interpret this translation. One obvious direction into which we could go, and we should go, is using as mediation an extended an extended concept of war, especially if we admit, along Mittian lines, that its counterpart is an absolute dichotomy of the friend and the enemy, which commands the transposition of war into politics and leaves apparently no neutral or intermediary possibility. The racial other of the nation is always defined as an essential enemy, threatening the nation not only with defeat or submission, but with dissolution, especially when it is represented as an enemy from inside, acting as a poison against the national community. I would say, however, that this only pushes the difficulty one step further, since we are still missing the imaginary or symbolic element that forces the representation of the community into the existential dilemma of absolute war dilemmas. In previous essays, I suggested that this element, again, is genealogy or the genealogical schema. In a central chapter of Race, Nation, Class, called The Nation Form, History and Ideology, I proposed a parallel between two ways of constructing a fictitious ethnicity for the national community under the authority and the control of the state. The creation of a national language or nationalization of language whose main institutional mediation is the school system, and we know that this doesn't work everywhere in the same manner. And the invention of a national heredity, perhaps I should rather say pseudo-heredity, whose institutional mediation is the administrative control of the family relations, regulating marriages, legitimating filiations, etc., in order to represent or to be able to represent the nation as a great family or a family of families sharing the same ascendancy. Forgive me for giving the French examples, the famous or infamous formula, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls, and the same progeny, the petit français, the little Frenchmen to come. The imaginary of the lineage is thus at the same time neutralized for private alliances and transferred onto the nation itself, which is supposed to embody the continuity of generations, linking old and new generations in a single process of transmission of characters, values, or even blood. This also allows, or seems to impose, to exclude from the great family all those groups and individuals who, for social or historic reasons, must remain unequal, discriminated, or subjugated. Conversely, as shown in the history of such nations of immigrants as the US, the United States, France, to a certain extent, or Israel today, it provides a powerful instrument to ascribe a fictitious common origin, namely racial, to the nationals of diverse origins whose real ancestors never shared any territory or language. Where the line of demarcation between exclusion and inclusion exactly passes is of course a matter of conflict, continuously shifting and dependent on various factors, such in particular as religion. Witness the case of the Irish Catholics in the US, who passed from one side to the other during the last century. In a subsequent text from 2011, arising from my classes at University of California, Irvine, called The Genealogical Schema, Race and Culture, that was published in a corner, it's difficult to find. I tried to elaborate further on this idea by introducing three additional elements, which I shall now indicate very briefly. First, I noted, following a suggestion from Alice Eve Weinbaum, that the genealogical scheme is an instrument to regulate sexual relations as much as national or political membership. It is typically intersectional, no less productive of sexism than racism. In fact, it allows for an understanding of the intrinsically gendered character of the fictitious ethnicity and the crucial function played by sexual interdictions and the control of the body of women in the construction of race. The relations of power and domination must be observed from the two sides simultaneously. Second, I noted, after the late French anthropologist, also a friend of mine in the past, Claude Meillassoux, who wrote this extraordinary book on the anthropology of slavery, that the extreme form of institutional racism, namely slavery in its various degrees, but this, of course, particularly applies to the Atlantic slave trade and the slave work in the plantations, does not rely on a contrast between antithetic or separated genealogies deemed incompatible. Rather, it relies on the contrast between the genealogy or the positive genealogy of the masters and the negative or the non-genealogy of the slaves, who are violently cut from their ancestors and prevented from parenting children, therefore creating families, a violence that is part of their dehumanization and of course also matches the appropriation of the body of slave women by their masters. This dissymmetric pattern can be extended to a general notion of the unequal genealogies of the different races constructed in a relationship of domination, whereby the act of generation, I return to this in a minute, transmits nobility or supremacy on one side and abjection or deficiency on the other. Finally, I noted that, particularly today, in the case of the racialization of immigrant workers, who are brutally segregated and harassed, becoming the main target of institutional or systemic racism in some countries of the North, and perhaps also elsewhere, a tragic double bind is imposed on the relationship of the subjects to their genealogy, especially, this is especially true for the descendants of the immigrants themselves, who are born in the country and as a consequence, most of the time are also formerly citizens. They are simultaneously prevented from freely exercising in the public sphere their religious or cultural traditions inherited from their parents, from entertaining family ties with their country of origin, which is deemed a behavior which is deemed anti-national. And contradictorily, they are continuously ascribed to their origins or their heredity, which is supposed to explain why they would be unable to become assimilated into the national culture and system of values, so-called values, which also creates a symmetric double bind in the attempt, or for the attempt by immigrants and their children to live and vindicate their multiple genealogies or belongings, a situation increasingly frequent, we could say even normal in today's world, but precisely stigmatized and suppressed by racist nationalist ideologies. The three additions that I propose do indeed complicate the idea of the genealogical schema, but they also strengthen, it seems to me, the hypothesis that it provides a guiding thread to examine the transformations of racism, the migration, as it were, of racisms between past and future. This is what I want to elaborate now more precisely. My first point can be or should be brief, at least for the sake of today's discussion, because it simply develops what has been already indicated. As I expanded the use of the category genealogy, I also discovered the necessity to increase its complexity and its articulation with other terms. Together, they form what I would call a semantic constellation which has internal tensions, structural lines of opposition, strong elements of repetition, but also uncertain frontiers, and which was never fixed, but keeps a powerful family air over time. It is my conviction that this constellation is permanently, in fact, obsessively haunting the constructions of race and neighboring categories such as caste. Therefore, its interpretation is a crucial key for the discussion of how racism evolves and overlaps or intersects with other institutions and ideologies of, I would say, enduring domination. Describing this constellation and its variation is a work in progress. It is also immediately dependent on issues of translation, which can be very problematic. I'm aware of that. Recurrent points of controversy, such as the translation of these very terms, heredity, or taking the problem from the other side, Varna and Jati, into European languages. However, a few points can be emphasized. First and most important, the constellation of terms that structure the idea of genealogy mainly derives from its association with the polysemic term generation. The genealogy is basically the order of successive generations, which themselves arise from the act of generation, conceiving or begetting a progeny and its repetition. The act is individualized, the result is collective, manifesting that individuals are always already embedded in social relations and meanings. This relationship expresses itself in the extraordinary multiplicity of categories, most of them endowed with juridical definitions, but encompasses broader phenomena, which describe the moments of any genealogy: reproduction, filiation, transmission or even tradition, legacy and inheritance, etc. Anthropologists observing so-called primitive societies, that is, non-European colonized societies, have privileged such notions as kinship or lineage, which typically identify pre-modern social forms as elementary structures of human culture. It seems to me that there is a risk here of blurring the fact that the composition of generations and the definition of what passes from one to another, or what it is their function to transmit, always involves in different proportions biological or biopolitical processes, affective and therefore also imaginary relations, and symbolic structures. Genealogy therefore belongs to no single domain of reality. It is a meta-discourse which governs uses and regulates conflicts among them, continuously traveling metaphorically from nature to culture, from life to spirit, from necessity to convention. If this is the case, we may clarify right away the vexed question of the transition from so-called biological racism to so-called cultural racism or racism without races. Incidentally, I did not invent that formula, but I was one of its first users. The scientific concept of race, quote, unquote, derived from an ideological interpretation of the Darwinian theory of evolution was never a purely biological concept, and therefore no such thing as biological races ever existed. They always already resulted from an incorporation of juridical, economic, theological, political representations into the biological reasoning. But conversely, the discourses of radical heterogeneity and mutual incompatibility, which substitutes cultural conflict to the war of races, for example, the idea of the clash of civilization, remain completely racist because they are also based on genealogy. Biological racism was already genealogical, and it was not the first system of genealogical classification of humans, as we will see in a minute, and cultural racism remains more than ever genealogical, with the hereditary substance generating collective identity transported from the body to the spirit. The reason for the substitution of one to the other was not an epistemological break. It was the result of the disqualification of the idea of biological race after the dramatic collapse of Nazism and apartheid, later apartheid. And this is probably not the final development. Contemporary revivals of the idea of eugenics under the impact of new biotechnologies and their commodification suggest the possibility, very strongly suggest, the possibility of a new biological racism requiring a new genealogical discourse. To which we can add a crucial supplement as scholars working in the continuation of Foucault's pioneering studies on the developments of biopolitics and their correlation to the anthropological discourse have shown. A genealogical discourse is never purely descriptive. It is intrinsically normative and socially prescriptive, sometimes very violently. This comes from the fact that the other side of the genealogical idea and the problematic of transmission is a problematic of degeneracy, perceived as a threat or even a fate for the society, the class, the nation, and humankind as such, which calls for a strategy of defense, prevention, and sanction. If generation creates normal, healthy, sane humans, it can also, nay, it must, create abnormals and monsters, against which, to put it in Foucault's words, there were a quotation in fact, society must be defended. This is illustrated and applied over time to diverse issues. The danger of misalliance, or in ugly anthropological terminology, hypogamy for aristocrats and upper castes, the dangers of interbreeding and miscegenation for white rulers in the colony, the dangers of epidemics, diseases, hereditary physical and moral handicaps propagated by the poor and the lower classes or castes in the industrial society. There is probably a possibility to articulate the idea of degeneracy with the age-old idea of purity and impurity, whether religiously sanctioned or not, but I don't see here a simple equivalence. What is sure is that the idea of degenerated races or degenerated cultures is a permanent instrument of power and its conversion into politics of segregation and elimination. Finally, I want to insist on the idea that the tensions inherent in the application of the genealogical schema always crystallize around questions asked about the meaning and conditions of birth, birthright, and destination by birth, which of course are particularly well illustrated by the discourse of caste and caste hierarchy. Racism is obsessed by birth, but the questions loom larger, therefore allowing us to understand why racism, even in its most violent forms, is never a discourse artificially imposed on the normal preoccupations of social subjects, but rather a becoming of their most intimate questions, which they address to themselves and to their neighbors and kids. What does it mean to be born from or to someone, a mother, but also a father, a couple, a family, or a lineage? For whom? For whose service, love, benefit, continuation is one born? What counts as a place of birth, whether a home, a household, a country, a part of the world? Which are the effects of this or that birthright or birthplace in terms of status, inheritance, handicaps, possibilities? Hannah Arendt in particular had an intuition of the importance of the question of birth at the junction of anthropology and politics, which call for a whole phenomenological inquiry. We could also try and follow the lead of the Nietzschean distinction by Friedrich Nietzsche between the origin, in German Ursprung, and the provenance, in German Herkunft, on which Foucault insisted in his elaboration of the idea of genealogy as a key to the discussion of what is lost, the origin calling for a return, and what is given or imposed by the conditions of birth so as to appear as one's property or character. I will now try and move to a discussion of the genealogical scheme more precisely articulated with the debate on the substantial identity or analogy or homology of the categories caste and race, not only because I am aware that this debate is of primary importance in a conference like yours, taking place in the capital city of India, the country, subcontinent, civilization, where this social structure is supposed to have its home, although under a foreign name, caste, coming from the Portuguese, which perhaps is, and certainly is, problematic. but because I believe it offers a unique possibility to locate our discussions about structures of discrimination and architectures of inequality in a broader and more adequate space-time than just modernity or the capitalist world system, however important such categories are. Of course, I claim no expertise at all in this domain. I'm entirely relying on what I learned from recent readings, particularly the reading of Divya, Dwivedi and Shailesh Mohan's book, Indian Philosophy, Indian Revolution on Caste and Politics, published in 2024 in London, and some related essays. I will address the issue in two steps. First, a reflection on the so-called lessons from Durban, the conference that took place in 2001, where a group of Dalit organizations tried and ultimately failed to impose the classification of the caste system as it is prevailing today in India as a form of racism, together with apartheid in the internationally accepted definition of the term. Second, a brief comparison between the principle of inequality and the forms of discrimination perpetuated under the name caste and certain specific forms of racism, sometimes described by historians as proto-racism, taking place in European history, namely the system of hereditary discriminations and repressions based on the statutes of the purity of blood, promulgated in Spain in the late 15th century and early 16th century at the time of the achievement of the Reconquista against the Moors and the beginning of the conquista of the American colonies inhabited by so-called Indians. Not by chance also the region where, as I recalled a moment ago, the name casta in Portuguese originated to become projected more or less adequately onto Indian realities, and thus closing the circle, as it were. The importance of Durban, as I understand it, arises from two aspects of the debate, which are, of course, interrelated, and you will correct me if I'm wrong. One is the inscription of the caste system and particularly its effects on the conditions of life and work, the dignity and the security of the lower castes, particularly the intouchables or Harigans, Gandhi's denominations, or Dalits, oppressed, the preferred denomination of their emancipatory movements, within the general framework of the statements on race, which had been promulgated by UNESCO in 1950 and 1951 and became the theoretical basis for the monitoring of anti-discrimination policies by United Nations agencies. This involved, first of all, an agreement of definition of both terms of the comparison, the caste and the race, supposed to be well-defined categories. The other aspect, is the resulting possibility of establishing a bond of solidarity a transnational bond of solidarity between the Dalit movement of emancipation and other anti-racist movements and mutually supporting struggles in the world in the wake of the abolition of South African apartheid and the continuity of anti-colonial processes. Hence, it raised the issue of deciding on which basis theoretical and practical resistances and movements, which are by definition local, rooted in specific histories of oppression, can be seen as parts of a global struggle or considered as contributions to a transformation of the world as such. At Durban, as we all know, I leave aside the important details regarding the two parallel conferences of state delegations and NGOs, the so-called National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights tried to have the situation of Dalits in India internationally recognized as a case of permanent violation of human rights by inscribing the caste discrimination in the, permanent violation of human rights by inventing the caste, inventing or inserting, I'm not sure, inscribing, yes, the caste discrimination in the subcontinent, which survives the inscription in the Constitution, a discrimination that survives the inscription of the Constitution co-written by Dr. Ambedkar of an interdiction of discriminations based on birth or origin. A similar interdiction does exist in the French Constitution and others. In the more, so they tried, it's badly written, I was in a haste, to have this caste discrimination inscribed in the more general framework of racial discrimination, implicitly comparing it to apartheid in the very country that had just abolished it. After hectic polemics, as we know, this claim was rejected as a consequence of two convergent moves. Sorry for repeating what everybody knows. I'm learning by the same. On one side, the lobbying of the Indian government, which denied the equivalence of the categories because race, as rejected by the UNESCO statements, is a biological category, whereas caste, not so much Varna probably as Jati, is a social division of labor or function based on cosmological principles and religious interdictions. And asserted, the Indian government asserted that questions of social inequalities in the country are a matter of national sovereignty, not liable to international surveillance in the name of human rights. On the other side, more or less directly connected to the political initiatives, a scientific campaign was waged by sociologists and anthropologists like André Béteille, for example, working mainly in the continuity of Louis Dumont's Homo hierarchicus and referring to the famous refutation of racism by the great Franz Boas, who had paved the way for the UNESCO statements, especially the first, describing race as a, I quote, a biological myth. They revived the ancient debate about race as caste, especially comparing the persecution of Jews in Europe to the discrimination against the pariahs in India, another categorization of the untouchables. They insisted on the theoretical difference between a hierarchic system of ranks in a society of orders and statuses, a social stratification made more rigid or even repressive by its overdetermination in terms of religious rules of purity and impurity, and the prohibition of intermarriages and sexual intercourse on one side, and an ideology discriminating individuals in a society that is officially egalitarian, the modern Northern or Western society, on the basis of such physical markers as skin color and the idea of the transmission of ethnic characters through genetic laws. Of course, the sensitive category that can be read on both sides of this dilemma is precisely descent. In other terms, genealogy, the secret determination of the whole debate, I would suggest. And the third category that cannot be completely left aside is class, as argued mainly by Marxists like Claude Meillassoux that I mentioned before. He wrote an essay on whether castes are classes and so on. Are there classes in India, castes in India, or in their own commentaries on the debate? although it becomes itself, the idea of class, divided, depending on whether you see caste as a structure of domination tracing back to very old pre-modern theological political structures that is used by the dominant classes to reproduce and enforce class privileges in terms of power, wealth, dignity, and so on, or race. You see a race as an ideology that masks and displaces the class divisions and the class struggle in capitalist societies so that their latent civil war, Marx's terms in the Communist Manifesto, is converted into an imaginary antagonism independent of the economic structures. This is very general indeed, I'm aware, and subject to rectifications, but I leave the details of the discussion aside and I follow Divya Dwivedi in her remarkable essay on remnants of Durban towards a critical philosophy of caste and race that she generously shared with me. I'm not sure if it is already published, in which she emphasizes the meaning of the formula used by Dalit representatives such as Prakash Louis after Durban. Caste is race and plus, which I understand in the logic of supplement as stating that caste should not be understood as a retreat from the racializing processes, but on the contrary, as adding specific historical dimensions to a general or generic notion of discrimination through descent that exceeds biology and lies at the roots of every new racism or renewed racism. To which she adds two important ideas, which of course call for discussion, I'm sure. Namely, one, that the analysis of the caste system as it works today must be inscribed comparatively in a vast critical debate, the so-called critical philosophy of race, which discusses the analogies and homologies between different systems of social, political, and moral discrimination that, I quote, have the same function of inclusion for exploitation through exclusion as born inferior. I find this formula quite remarkable, where she also quotes the famous letter from 1946 sent by Ambedkar to Du Bois, asserting, I quote, the similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and the position of the Negroes in America, 1946. And two, she also adds the idea that the caste system, however deeply modified and variously implemented over the centuries, especially during the colonial era, which imposed its current procedures of census and classification, is not only analogous to other racisms or offering homologies with the evolution leading from the biological to the cultural definitions of race or the new racisms, but it is also a prototype, or as she calls it, a paleo-racism, an idea that becomes crucial for the entire genealogy of global racism if we admit, as philology suggests, that the Aryan myth that served to elaborate and ground the state anti-Semitism as well as white supremacism in Europe and America actually originates from India in direct combination with the caste hierarchy. It was not projected upon India. Of course, it was endowed with all sorts of other more or less imaginary or philological properties, but it was not projected upon India by the Europeans as part of their Orientalism, but first borrowed or inherited from there and adapted to their own political and ideological needs. This is not, of course, to be accepted without debate, but certainly it hints at the necessity of rethinking the whole genealogy of race or genealogy of the genealogical scheme in a space-time that is broader, longer, and more circular or reciprocal than the accepted stories of modernity, whether liberal or Marxist, would suggest. I will now move to my conclusion by indicating two orders of questions that occurred to me while examining these hypotheses and relating them to other debates. First, there's a crucial discussion to be conducted about the understanding of racism as a global phenomenon beyond the simple recognition of the fact that every discrimination based on naturalized anthropological differences falls under the jurisdiction of humanitarian law and universalistic principles, the United Nations jurisdiction, if you want. Such an understanding can and probably must be looked for in different directions. Either one takes as a guiding thread, and I am not far from, I'm not rejecting that, the idea of racializing processes which immediately or progressively take place at world scale in the form of a global partition. Schmidt called it a nomos of the earth, or a transnational, if you like, scheme of pattern of segregation, a targeted persecution which crosses borders, leading to the identification at world scale of absolute victims or the myth of the universal enemy. This is the schema that clearly operates, and we are completely dependent on that idea in our critiques of contemporary racism. In the drawing of the color line, first invented by Du Bois and later generalized by anti-racist movements in America and elsewhere, across all continents, but also of the great, this is the other line, the great Orientalist divide between the West and the rest, as proposed by Edward Said and others. It is a crucial and difficult question to decide whether, along the past centuries, something like global anti-Semitism, and today, but it's not a recent phenomenon, global Islamophobia have inscribed themselves in such patterns of persecution and violence at world scale, operating at world scale. But there is another possibility which relies on the purpose of looking for analogies and homologies between processes of racialization, therefore production of races rooted in specific local singular histories, histories of nations, empires, even civilizations, which have specific genealogies but also exhibit correspondences, can be put in dialogue, sometimes involve circularities. It is here that I find it particularly interesting to return to the remarkable etymology of the name caste, casta, and the old idea of the correspondences between the history of the pariah peoples, the Dalits in India and the Jews in Europe, as it was famously discussed by Max Weber and others. I rely in particular on the extraordinary recent work, forgive me for doing some propaganda, published in France by Jean-Frédéric Schaub, S-C-H-A-U-B, and Sylvia Sebastiani, Sebastini, Race et Histoire dans les sociétés occidentales, Race and History in Western Societies, 15th to 18th century, published in 2021, very recent. It's a huge volume, which brings in important qualifications to the received ideas about different and heterogeneous racisms. The core, I simplify enormously, is the description of the institution in the 16th and since the late 15th century, in fact, and 17th century Spain, more generally the Hispanic realm, of the infamous Estatutos de Limpieza de Sangre, statutes of the purity of blood, which made it possible to exclude and torture, burn, persecute the conversos and moriscos, the descendants of forcefully converted Jews and Muslims after the Reconquista, the Christian destruction of the Islamic Caliphate and kingdoms in Spain. These statutes are now widely considered to be the prototypes of the later system of persecution of the Jews by the Nazis, particularly through their definition of genealogical criteria for the identification of the so-called invisible Jews, hiding themselves behind Christian identities and so on. They explicitly include rules of untouchability and sanctions against sexual intercourse and marriage between members of incompatible families. Above all, they take place at the point of transition or transference between a past and a future in two significant manners. They operate a transference of the birthright of aristocrats, their lineage, their caste in the Hispanic sense, to the dominant population in the framework of the colonial empire, as if all the Spaniards and Portuguese who now travel to Brazil and Latin America to become masters, rulers, and exploiters form a kind of new nobility at world scale. And a transference of the religious, but in fact political persecution waged against the impure blood of the Jews and Muslims in Europe towards the extermination, enslavement, subjection of the inferior, so-called inferior or subject races in the New World, the colony. They are very precise and detailed about the way in which the statutes are exported to the Americas and implemented in the subjugation and violent exploitation of the natives, Native American and the Africans, called respectively Indians and Negroes. So that a new racism already built on the extension, itself on the extension of an old one through the extension and the continuation of the genealogical scheme. Perhaps we could venture as a working hypothesis that in modern history, and globally speaking, a new racism is always the continuation and reformulation of a paleo-racism, genealogy, whether biological or cultural, forming the intermediate. Let me conclude. I know that I was much too long. In very few sentences. The intellectual and political movement against architectures of inequality is more than ever and will be increasingly in the future geared towards the abolition of racist discrimination, both in the form of remnants resurgences and revivals of ancient racisms and in the form of new racisms. The criterion here is always the same: whether differences are transformed into instruments of power and domination of some humans over others, who translate them in terms of inferiority and superiority granted by nature. However, the detour through the complex and fascinating although terrible history of caste and race suggests important supplements to this general idea. There is no struggle against systemic or institutional discriminations in the present that does not involve a re-elaboration of the past, hence a modification of the ways in which it overdetermines the present, both in the form of a critical rewriting of the history of our civilizations and in the form of symbolic and material redress of the injustices and the violences whose traces remain effective in present lives of the oppressed people, the Dalits of the world, so to speak. Second, it is the very complex of notions forming the genealogical schema and its possible mutations, affecting such notions as descent, birth, generation, inheritance, parenthood, affiliation, belonging, kinship, etc., that is at stake symbolically and practically in the confrontation with old, paleo, and new racisms. A confrontation that is likely to become profoundly affected by such diverse phenomena as the intensification of global worldwide migrations and the impact of biotechnologies and artificial reproduction. But this calls for another discussion. In a sense, my contribution today, although much too long, was just a preliminary. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Etienne. I think this extension of the genealogical schema, its interrogation for the times to come, has given us a lot of new tools. And I think we will look forward to the publication of this extremely dense, wide-ranging meditation. I'm sure there are lots of questions. We are certainly running out of time, and we have another keynote afterwards, but I request you to pose brief questions. We can collect a few questions and then request Professor Balibar to respond altogether.
Divya?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excuse me, because of age and physiological problems, I need a 2 minutes break. Can I have that?
Okay. Okay.
I'm back.
Yes. Okay, please come back. We will be here.
I'm back in less than 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry for that.
No problem. That was
I'm sure
very
you
short
understand that
and
an old man is
no problem.
He's not a young man.
Okay, so we are back for the questions and there are mics, so please raise your hands.
Professor Balibar, thanks for your keynote address.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is, when you made the distinction between biological racism and cultural racism, we move from the body to the spirit. Is my recollection okay? Yeah. Yeah, so then...
That is your question.
No. My question is, my question is, does the caste order represent cultural racism because it deals with the spirit? And if it is dealing with the spirit, it's also dealing with the self. And it gives rise to the politics of the self by anti-caste politics in the colonial period. So how much, because even in my presentation, which I'm going to give tomorrow, I am detecting this genealogical schema from biological racism to cultural racism. So how much does the caste order represent cultural racism as it deals with the spirit?
Any?
Okay, I can't.
Okay,
I can't.
why don't you answer it?
Yes?
Maybe there'll be one more question and then be. Yes, please go ahead.
No, I'd be very strange. I hear my own voice now. No, it's okay. I use the categories biological racism and cultural racism in a very cautious and in fact reluctant manner. I think that these categories and political and theoretical categories tried to registrate, I would say, and to take into account important mutations, if you like, in the dominant and particularly official discourses that discriminate among humans. So that, and in that sense, of course, the UNESCO statements, I'm not going back to that, it's a fascinating history, because there are two statements with 1 year distance. They are both accepted by the United Nations and the UNESCO, and to a large extent they contradict one another, because the first, written by anthropologists, explain that the biological notion of race is a pure myth, and the second explained that largely written by British biologists and medical scholars, explains that this cannot be entirely ruled out. But in any case, I believe that the significant fact is that the official discourse justifying discriminations moved and had to move from one language to another. But and therefore today, of course, you will find no government, at least in Europe or in America, that says something like the migrants coming from the south are biologically inferior, or they represent a threat for our descendancy through their intermarriages and so on and so on. The discourse that you hear is a cultural or civilizational and increasingly also a pseudo-religious discourse. Their culture is incompatible with ours. So I could continue on that, but I already said that I believe that something in fact remained profoundly stable, invariant, of course, from one discourse to the other, and it is, in my view, the interest and perhaps the usefulness of this idea, this hypothetic idea of the genealogical scheme, to show why the element of continuity is more important than the element of discontinuity. But then, and I'll stop there because I cannot be longer, you raise another crucial question, which I would frame as the philosophical, profoundly philosophical question of how a discourse about anthropological differences, and therefore inevitably about what characterizes the human as such, and gives an account or includes the consideration of anthropological differences within its representation of the human is bound to cross, I would say, very generally, such metaphysical issues as dualism, body and soul, or spirit, and other ontological dilemmas. So I'm not saying we passed from the dominance of the body to the dominance of the spirit or any of its equivalent, but certainly different racializing or discriminating discourses involve a completely different economy, if you like, conceptual economy of the relationship of body and mind or spirit. But my impression is that you never have something like a complete separation or a binary choice between a language, materialistic language of the body, and a spiritualistic language of the soul and the culture, because the so-called biological insistence on bodily differences is completely permeated with symbolic and spiritualistic, I would say, consequences and preconditions, and consequences and on the other side, of course, and that's where, of course, I'm too ignorant of that, but the comparison between issues of untouchability on the side of the Indian theory of caste, and impurity or also intouchability on the side of the relationship between Christians and Jews becomes so important, because perhaps the general idea or the starting point is a kind of spiritual antagonism, but the consequences are immediately drawn in terms of what you do with your body and the body of the others. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question, but I find it extremely interesting.
There are two questions we request at the back, and then Professor Dhanda, very quick and very short answer so that the next speaker can...
Sorry, I'm terrible.
Professor Balibar, thank you for giving us a genealogy and schema of institutional discrimination. Towards the end, more or less in a passing way, you made a reference to Islamophobia. We in India are right now living in the theater of both caste as well as an Islamophobic, institutionalized discrimination. We believe so. And this Islamophobia is not absent outside India. Right from Renaissance onwards, you have this like Islamophobic understanding in Western civilization. But while, I of course missed maybe the initial 5 minutes of your, or 10 minutes of your presentation, so I'm sorry if you covered it right at the beginning. But I thought Islamophobia in passing is not the way to deal with what we are subjected to in a larger sense. Your comments on that. Thank you.
Is not, forgive me, you said it is not the way. So you think it's not a good category?
No. It is a category, and we need to speak and also recognize it more than in passing. When we talk about the genealogical schema of discrimination, I believe when we look at racism, when we look at casteism, Islamophobia is there right alongside. Not just
Yes.
of course, in your analysis, anti-Semitism is very much there. But along with anti-Semitism of the past and the present, we have a certain Islamophobic present as well. So how do we deal with that? Thank you.
No, I understand. I understand. Forgive me, I will not give a satisfactory answer. I agree that this is an urgent and a question, and I believe that, I mean, seen from Europe and America, where I have lived and worked, the the debate. First of all, it's a very harsh and debate. Believe it or not, but the use of the category Islamophobia is, in fact, officially interdicted, forbidden in my country. You can be punished for using that term. And it's and there are instructions by the Ministry of Education to prevent the use of this term in schools and universities and so on. Now this is so this shows how burning and how sensitive the issue is. And of course, what adds to its to the tension are, and these are two interconnected elements. First, the comparisons with anti-Semitism, the idea that the so-called new anti-Semitism or renewed anti-Semitism is essentially based in expresses the attitudes of Muslims in France and outside. And needless to say, of course, the tragedy and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the genocide in Gaza, and things like that. So it's not. So I would just say that caught in that situation, where I personally, of course, I mean, I defended as seriously as I could the idea that we cannot fight anti-Semitism as we must do. If we do not fight against Islamophobia, at least as well, excuse me. But in order to get a better view of all that, we absolutely must take into account the situation in other parts of the world, especially the Indian subcontinent, India, Myanmar, and so on. And so I'm not trying to reduce any local situation to any other one, but I ask the question: what kind of correspondences, circulations, maybe of ideas and attitudes, and perhaps also historical memories and myths can you take into account if you want to seriously address this fact, that some sort of Islamophobia becomes extremely active and violent at both extremities of the world today.
Thank you very much. These are.
I did exactly what I was trying to do.
So, Etienne, thanks again for answering these questions. There are many more from the audience, but very unfortunately, as we are running late and our next
Of course,
keynote speaker
unfortunately,
is
it's
here.
I apologize. It's my fault.
Not at all.
It's my fault. I'm always too long. I finish writing 2 minutes before starting to speak, and I don't have the time to cut.
So we are going to resume the next session after a 5-minute tea break. I know it's very short, but I request your indulgence. You have been a great audience. And I'm sure that many similar questions will come up in the next one, and we can continue the discussion. So, Nancy, we are just going to resume in 5 minutes. Thank you so much for your patience. And encore, merci beaucoup, mille fois, Etienne.
Merci.
Et à très bientôt.
À très bientôt.
Merci, merci.